All right. Looks like I forgot my earbuds. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So I'm going to put the source in the chat as usual. And if anyone is listening to this in the future on the voice recording or on the video recording and they would like the sources, they can feel free to reach out to me at deborahklapper@gmail.com and I'd be happy to share them. Okay, now I'm going to share my screen so we can all look at it together. Okay, and now we finally, after 13 shiurim, we finally get to Magid. And you'll see that we're going to spend a lot less time on Magid than we spent, for example, on Kiddush or Havdalah. But we'll see. Okay, so also that the material tonight is disproportionately in the Mishnah, which is unusual, but that's what it is this time. Okay, so we begin with the Mishnah here, Matnitin. Rabban Gamliel Omer, Kol Shelo Amar Shlosha Dvarim Elu BePesach LeYatza Yedei Chovato VeElu Hein Pesach Matzah Umaror. So we're all familiar with this because it comes almost basically unchanged into our Haggadot. Rabban Gamliel said that there are three things that if you don't say them at the Seder, you didn't fulfill your obligation. And they are Pesach and Matzah and Maror. But we'll see that the text here in the Mishnah of what you're supposed to say about them is not exactly the same as what we have. Ours is a little bit more filled out. Pesach, al shum shepasach hamakom abatei avotenu b'Mitzrayim, shneamar ve'amartem zevach Pesach hu la'Hashem asher Pesach. The Pesach, you're supposed to say that it's because God passed over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt. And this one, in fact, the pasuk that's quoted is not about the Pesach itself. It's about telling your children in the future about the Pesach. So that seems like a very strong demonstration for Rabban Gamliel that there is, in fact, a mitzvah to tell your children, I'm offering this korban and this is why. As opposed to the other two where the psukim seem to be proof texts explaining why we eat the stuff as opposed to explaining why we need to teach our children about it. So they don't exactly fit together properly. Matzah al shum shenigalu avotenu mimitzrayim shene'amar v'yofu et habatzek asher hotziu mimitzrayim. Matzah, because we were rescued from Egypt. And in my Haggadah, it says because we were rescued from Egypt quickly and we didn't have time to make food, and it goes on for a whole sentence in that theme. But here it just says because we were rescued from Egypt. And the pasuk is they baked the dough that they had taken out of Egypt. Right. So presumably the text that I have in my Haggadah is trying to connect up the proof text with the fact that we're talking about matzah with the fact that we're talking about being redeemed from Egypt, and it's trying to connect those three things. Maror al shum shemeru hamitzrim et chayei avotenu b'Mitzrayim shne'amar ve'maru et chayeihem. And maror, because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our ancestors, as it says, and they embittered their lives. Okay, so let's scroll down. Now we have this as a text in our Haggadah for reciting or possibly for interpreting. In the Mishnah, it is not clear to me that that's what it is. It seems to me distinctly possible that it may be an instruction, not a text for recitation. But that is how we ended up using it. In every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he had left Egypt. And yes, I realize that that's a sort of strange translation because person is non-gendered and himself is gendered. But as it happens, Hebrew has a word for person, which is not gendered and does not have any pronouns that are not gendered. And so that's just what you end up with if you try to do something non-gendered. שנאמר, והגעת לבנך ביום ההוא לאמור, בעבור זה עשה השם לי בצאתי ממצרים. And the proof text here is, you will tell your son on that day saying, because of this, God did for me when I left Egypt. Now, the Mishnah here is particularly interested in this pasuk because in the 13th chapter of Shemot, where this pasuk appears, it's talking about the distant future when you will someday in the land of Israel be explaining to your children about the exodus from Egypt, which will by then be in the distant past, and is presumably not addressed to the people who are actually leaving. It's presumably addressed to their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren. And yet it says, when I left Egypt, in the thing that you're supposed to say to your children at this point in the distant future. And so it seems that the pasuk is prescribing for all time that the part of the Seder experience is to describe yourself as the person leaving. It's also worth noting while we're here that there appears to be a preposition missing, or something missing, right? Because of this, God did for me when I left Egypt. It seems like it should be because of this, which God did for me. Like I'm making the Pesach because of the thing that God did for me. But instead, it seems that it's actually ultimately saying the opposite, right? That because of this, and you're pointing at the Seder foods, because of this, God took me out of Egypt. Which raises the possibility that the reason we have the Exodus is so that we can have the Seder and not the other way around. That is a theme which runs through a whole bunch of different things in this chapter and in the Haggadah. And it's just worth keeping in mind that the causality is not at all clear here. Okay, לפיכך, אנחנו חייבים להודות, להלל, לשבח, לפאר, לרומם, להדר, לברך, להלל, לקלס. למי שעשה לאבותינו ולנו על כל הניסים האלו. Now we're definitely switching back to a text which is intended to be recited. But it seems to be connecting the idea that we are seeing ourselves as the people who left Egypt with the idea that we owe gratitude to God, right? Which the Haggadah expands on in any number of ways which are not included in this Mishnah, including most famously probably Dayenu, but also this paragraph, which I did not even bother trying to translate these synonyms for praise because I ran out of English words and I decided that you could imagine some synonyms for praise all by yourselves. But therefore, we're obligated to thank and praise to the one who did all of these miracles for our ancestors and for us. And we're not done with the sentence. Here's the rest of it. Hotzianu me'avdut l'cherut mi'agon l'simcha u'me'eva liyom tov u'me'afela l'or gadol u'mishibud l'geula v'nomar lefanav hallelujah. So this is the transition. We've gone from I see myself as having left Egypt to therefore I owe God gratitude to now here's the list of things that we're thanking God for. He took us from slavery to freedom and from misery to happiness and from mourning to celebration, darkness to light. This bears some resemblance to the list of contrasts that we had in the Havdalah, but it's not directly parallel, but it's sort of reminiscent. And from enslavement to redemption. And now we get the next transition is V'nomar lefanav hallelujah. Now we are going to have to say before him a praise of God, which brings us to the fact that the next thing that happens here is going to be the very beginning of Hallel. And the Mishnah seems to be assuming that we understand that that's what it means, because the very next thing without a transition is a dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about how far you go. So the dispute is this: Ad Heichan hu omer, how far does he say Hallel? Meaning, we're going to say the whole Hallel, but how much of it do you say before dinner? Beit Shammai omrim ad em habanim smecha. Beit Shammai says you go until the end of the first paragraph. Ubeit Hillel omrim ad chalamish l'mayno mayim, and Beit Hillel says you go until the end of the second paragraph. V'chotem begeula, and probably the words v'chotem begeula should not be on this line. Probably they should be on the next line, because probably they're not disputed. And I apologize, I didn't punctuate this very well. And then you conclude with a blessing about redemption. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, Asher ga'alanu v'ga'al et avotenu mitzrayim v'lo hayachotem. Rabbi Tarfon says, no, don't chotem begula. Don't say a Baruch atah Hashem ga'al Yisrael. Instead, say a longer bracha, Asher ga'alanu v'ga'al et avotenu mitzrayim, who redeemed us and redeemed our fathers from Egypt, and then don't add a brief blessing at the end. And we are going, as we have so many times in this chapter already, we're going to end up actually doing all of the things that everybody tells us to do, so that we're not following any of the positions. We're just sort of aggregating them all into one paragraph. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ken Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, Yagienu l'modim v'l'regalim acherim habayim l'kratei l'shalom, smechim b'vinyan yirecha v'sasim b'avodatecha, v'nochal sham min ha'zivachim u'min ha'psachim, v'chulei, ad Baruch atah Hashem ga'al Yisrael. So there are a couple of things that are notable here. One of them is that it is relatively unusual for the Mishnah to actually record the full text of a prayer, but very significant chunks of the Haggadah are actually here in the Mishnah, in a way that's unusual. It's not unheard of, but it's unusual. The other thing is that the Mishnah seems to assume that we know a longer text than this. It's got an etc. there in the middle of the paragraph. And so it seems like there is an even longer version, which is older than the Mishnah, which is being assumed by it. Exactly who stuck the etc. in, and whether it's a scribe somewhere along the way, or whether that's original to the Mishnah, that I have no way of knowing. Okay, then that gets us to the end of the Mishnah. This Mishnah was really very Haggadah heavy. Didn't have a lot of legal material in it, except for Rabban Gamliel, which is what Rava is going to respond to. So Amar Rava, Tzarich shiomar ve'otanu hotzi misham. Rava says, when you say the paragraphs that Rabban Gamliel wants you to say about the Pesach, the Matzah, and the Maror, you can't say he took our ancestors out of Egypt. You have to say ve'otanu hotzi misham. He took us out of Egypt, which seems to be fixing it to be compatible with the other part of the Mishnah where it said that you have to see yourself as leaving Egypt. Okay, and then Rava's got another instruction for how to do it. Amar Rava, matzah tzarich lahagbia, maror tzarich lahagbia. He says that you're supposed to pick up the matzah and the maror when you talk about them. Basar ein tzarich lahagbia. And when you talk about the Pesach, you don't pick up the meat. V'lo od elishin yir'eh k'ochel kodshim b'chutz. And in fact, you shouldn't, because if you do pick up the meat, then it appears that you are eating sacrificial meat outside the context of the temple, which is
Deborah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was waiting. I'm stuck on this. Oh shoot. The Rav, was it Rava?
Mm-hmm.
Tzarich sheyomar ve'otanu hotzi misham instead of.
Or maybe in addition to.
Well, because all three things that Rabban Gamliel is saying to mention, and then the reasons for that if it's him that he uses to justify that, every one of them says Avutenu, not just one.
So I think Rava is either adding to that text and saying, right, you should say, Al shum shepasach hamakom abatei avotenu mimitzrayim ve'otanu hotzi misham, or something like that. Or maybe, in fact, he even wants batenu b'mitzrayim instead of batei avotenu b'mitzrayim. I'm not sure if he's trying to change Rabban Gamliel's text or if he's just adding to it. But either way, he's not comfortable with the presentation of the Exodus as being something that happened in the past to somebody else.
Even though we have Bechol Dor Vador, which is sometime in the future where you're relating to the past. So in other words, we're here now talking about something that happened in the past, and it's pretty clear that's what's going on. So to say Chaye Avotenu,
I think Rava would say that he's telling you how to see yourself as if you had left Egypt. When you tell the story, tell it in the first person.
Okay.
And in fact, I had a student call me on this. I think it was last Pesach or the year before. And I was sitting with an elementary aged kid and we were talking about the Exodus and preparing for the Seder. And she said, why do you keep saying we? None of this ever happened to me. And like, see, literally, an actual little girl said this to me. And I said, well, because, and, you know, so we had a conversation about what it means to find your ancestors' experience relevant to you. And to be honest, I don't think she liked what I had to say very much. And she still thought I was nuts afterwards, but
I'm sure.
You know, well, we try. And
right.
It might get more believable the more times you say it. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I was just being too literal. That's okay. No, I understand the rationale.
Right. Well, so I think it's just a question of whether you like do it once or whether you integrate it into all of the different pieces of the Haggadah.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we get to an actual halachic discussion, our only one of the evening. Amar of Acha bar Yaakov, Summa patur milomar Haggadah. Rav Acha bar Yaakov says a blind person is exempt from saying Haggadah. Now, we need to step back just for a second for some background information. One thing is that we have a lot of discussion, actually, about the relationship between blind people and mitzvot. And there is a prominent position, in fact, that blind people are exempt from all positive mitzvot. I think we have to work on the assumption that Rav Acha bar Yaakov rejects that, or there wouldn't be much point in him saying this. But at the same time as we have these such discussions, there's also a notable series of very prominent rabbis who are blind. This is not happening because blind people are being excluded from the conversation. They are part of the conversation. But it seems like there are some mitzvot for which being able to see what you're doing is vital. In particular, for example, tzitzit, right? The description of the purpose of the mitzvah is that you're wearing them so that you can look at them. And then there are other mitzvot, like say, don't commit adultery, where it seems like your capacity to see is completely beside the point. And then it's not clear exactly where you draw the boundary. That's one background bit of information. The other information that is worth mentioning is that in general, when reading Torah, the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Gemara assume that the word zeh, this, can only attach to a physical object that is being physically pointed at. that gets you some very interesting interpretations of Ze Keli Van Vehu, but I don't want to go there right now. But for example, when God says to Moshe, "Hachodesh zelachem Rosh Chodashim," this is the first month of the year. To the rabbis, that means that God took Moshe outside and pointed at the shape in the sky of the new moon that had just become visible and said, "That's what you should look for when you're trying to see if it's the first of the month." Zeh always means you're pointing at something, and it always means you're pointing at something visible and physical. Okay, so and remember, we just had a Ba'avur Zeh that we quoted a few minutes ago as part of Rabban Gamliel's, it's part of the proof text that you should see yourself as having left Egypt. So that's where we're going now. So this is Rav Acha Bar Yaakov's interpretation that gets him to the exemption of blind people from the Seder.
Can I interrupt? Can I interrupt? I'm sorry. What I find interesting, though, which is totally an aside, is that it seems like this is the first place that the Haggadah is actually referred to as Haggadah, either as a noun or as the telling. Mm-hmm. We've just been going on and on about this is what you should do on the night that God took you out of Mitzrayim. We've never really referred to the amalgam of all these things as a Haggadah.
While that is true, I would be careful about assuming that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov means by Haggadah the same thing we mean. He might just mean Magid, which might be why it appears here. Right. Whereas we have in our Haggadah, we have, instructions for Karpas and Yachatz. Right. And we have Birkat HaMazon, and we have the whole text of Hallel. I don't know whether he meant that or whether he just meant Magid.
Even so, has the Mishnah ever referred to the sections of the Haggadah this way?
I don't think so.
Yeah, that's what struck me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, so Ketiv Hacha, it says here, and here is going to be our text that relates to our local topic. So it says about Pesach, Ba'avur Zeh, because of this, Uktiv Hatam, and it says there, and there is going to be, some other context. In this case, the context of Ben Sorer or Moreh. Ben Sorer or Moreh is the rebellious son who is found guilty of whatever it is he's found guilty of. It's not clear in the Torah. The Mishnah and the Gemara have him stealing money in order to buy expensive wine and meat and then gorging himself on it. In any case, he is then put to death on the testimony of his parents. Every aspect of this is odd. And by odd, I mean it breaks the normal rules of halachic discourse. Normally, you don't accept testimony from somebody's parents. Normally, we don't put people to death for being a gross person or for stealing. So the whole thing is very strange. But in any case, in the context there, the formula the parents are supposed to recite when they bring their child to court includes the words B'nenu Zeh, this our son. Or Malahalan Prat Lasuma. So just like over there, so this is Rav Acha Bar Yaakov talking now, just like in the case of the Ben Soreru Moreh, we would not allow a blind parent to declare their child a Ben Soreru Moreh because they can't point at them and say this one, while looking at them. So just like there, we exclude the blind person. Afkan Prat Lasuma. Here also the word this must be coming to exclude blind people. Now, it's not necessarily the case that we would read it that way, we go way out of our way to exclude anybody that we can exclude from Ben Sora or Moreh, simply because it seems like a very bad idea for it to exist. And so it's limited in ways that are surprising and extreme. There's a suggestion that you can't have Ben Sora or Moreh unless the parents look like each other and sound like each other and are the same height, right? Like it would go to some considerable extremes to guarantee this is never going to happen. But nonetheless, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov seems to be importing that idea from Ben Sora or Moreh to here to exclude a blind person from the storytelling in which you would say, because of this, God took me out of Egypt, which I think here might just be associated with Magid. I don't know that he would necessarily be extended to Hallel or to Kiddush or to, the other aspects of the Seder, although the Gemara will in a moment assume that whatever the status of matzah is, that's also the status of the storytelling. But they are very closely linked because you're supposed to be talking about the matzah. So I don't know exactly where the boundaries are. And in any case, Ini, is that really true that we would exclude blind people? V'ha'amar Maremar, but Maremar said, Sha'altinhu l'Rabbanan d'Bei Rav Yosef, Manda Amar Agadata Bei Rav Yosef. So he says, I personally went and asked the students in the house of Rav Yosef who used to say the Haggadah at Rav Yosef's house. Rav Yosef, and they said, Rav Yosef said it. And then I asked, Manda Amar Agadata Bei Rav Sheshet. I said, who said the Haggadah at Rav Sheshet's house? Rav Sheshet, and they said, Rav Sheshet said the Haggadah at his house. So it would appear that the practice in real life in the houses of the actual blind rabbis is that they're doing the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, and everybody else is fulfilling their mitzvah at least with them and possibly through them. So it sounds like they're participating in the mitzvah or possibly even doing the mitzvah for everybody else. So Kasavri Rabbanan, Matzah Bisman Hazeh D'Rabbanan. So it must be that the rabbis, which is to say Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef and all of their students, think that matzah in this time is rabbinic. Now, it's important to note that when we say Bisman Hazeh, we're perfectly comfortable with the idea that Bisman Hazeh covers everything in the last 2,000 years. And now, when we say the word now, we mean in the 2nd century or in the 5th century or in the 12th century or yesterday. Those are all the same thing. Because what Bisman Hazeh means is when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed and we don't have sovereignty in the land of Israel. And so the sense of time gets played with by the fact that what we care about hasn't changed in a long time. Okay, but so if you say that matzah is rabbinic, then from that we seem to be deriving that the obligation to talk about the matzah must also be rabbinic, because you can't have a Torah obligation to talk about something that there's no Torah obligation to have exist to begin with. That seems to be the theory, is that when the Torah obligation to eat matzah disappears, the Torah obligation to point at the matzah and talk about it should disappear along with it. And so if the rabbis said you have to eat matzah anyway, and you still have to do Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim anyway, then they presumably could make up whatever rules they want about that. And they could say that, even people who didn't have to do the Haggadah in its original Torah incarnation might still be required to do the rabbinic version. And that's what they're assuming at this point is Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef's position, such that they wouldn't disagree with Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. They would just be talking about different things. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov would be talking about the original mitzvah, and Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef would be living in the real world, which would be operating under a different system because the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Okay, but that has other implications. Michlal de Rav Acha bar Yaakov savar matzah bisman hazeh deoraita. Okay, but that would imply, supposing that Rav Acha bar Yaakov is talking about real life, that he thinks that matzah and the Seder today, by today would mean any time in the last 2,000 years, are deoraita, meaning the mitzvah to eat matzah and to say the Haggadah outlives the survival of the temple and the Pesach sacrifice. And then because if he's believing that the parameters for who has to eat the matzah and talk about the matzah are defined by the Torah, then we are at this moment assuming then that means that he thinks that the Torah is still what's telling us to do those things. But that isn't going to work because V'ha Rav Acha bar Yaakov hu da'amar matzah bisman hazeh d'Rabbanan. But that doesn't help because Rav Acha bar Yaakov, as it happens, is we know his position on that. And his position is that matzah is, in the absence of the temple, rabbinic. Therefore, the solution we've suggested is not going to work because he doesn't believe that. Okay, so now we suggest, well, okay, so Rav Acha bar Yaakov must believe that kasavar kol detakun rabbanan ke'ein deoraita tikun. He must believe that whenever the rabbis made a rule that you're supposed to do something, they made the parameters of the rule as close as possible to the Torah parameters for the equivalent rule. Here, it's relatively obvious what that would mean because the rabbis are sort of reinstating a Torah law that would have existed up until, right before the temple was destroyed. And they're just saying, well, we're going to keep doing it. So this would mean that we're going to keep doing it, means we're going to do the same thing we were doing before. But sometimes legislating using the same parameters as the Torah can mean that you make a completely new law, but you do it in the way that's most similar to the existing Torah laws.
So who are the Rabbanan here?
Well,
is it him? Is it Rav Sheshet?
No, it wouldn't be any of them. It would be, it would have to have been somebody from the generation after the destruction. Right, so the Sanhedrin sits right after the destruction of Yerushalayim and makes a number of decisions about how the Jewish people is going to go on with life. This is not, recorded as one of those decisions, but I think we're presuming that it would have been that generation of rabbis.
I see. Okay.
Around the same time as they're arguing about whether we blow shofar on Shabbat in Yavne. They would be discussing whether we still eat matzah now too, which would have been a real question because up until that point, the Seder was defined by the Korban Pesach. The decision that you can still have the Korban Pesach without, in effect, the guest of honor and the main course is that was a real decision. It seems to have worked out fine. It's been a very substantive and important religious event going on 2,000 years without the Korban Pesach at this point. But I don't know that that was a foregone conclusion in that moment.
The Korban Pesach, please remind me that's not Deoraita, right?
The Korban Pesach,
or is it?
When it exists, is certainly Deoraita. It's commanded repeatedly and at great length in Sefer Shemot, and then again in the layout of the holidays later. But,
right. So in this whole discussion, they're equating Haggadah and okay, so whatever that means, this section of Magid with matzah, which they say might be d'Rabbanan, but yet I kept thinking, well, it's not only about the matzah, it's about the Pesach too, and that's certainly d'Oraita, but then I thought maybe it's not.
But talking about the Korban Pesach can't be d'Oraita because we don't have a Korban Pesach. But we are still doing the part that involves the matzah. And I believe there's no machloket that maror is now d'Rabbanan. And the thing that there's a question about is matzah. So that's why they're suggesting that it could line up with that. In the end, they reject that, and everyone here decides that matzah is d'Rabbanan, and that's just not what we're arguing about.
Okay.
Okay. The thing is, though, that's not going to be. We can't be arguing about whether kol detakun Rabbanan kein deoraita takun, whether the rabbis legislate using Torah parameters, because l'Rav Sheshet v'l'Rav Yosef nami havadai kol detakun Rabbanan kein deoraita takun, because Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef also believe that every time the rabbis legislate, they use Torah parameters to do so. So that we haven't found any daylight between Rav Acha Bar Yaakov and Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef on any of these issues, such that they could explain why they seem to be disagreeing. So, well, we're going to need to re-examine this. It's okay over there. So in the case of the Ben Sora Umura, the text would make more sense if they would say B'nenu hu, he is our son. And instead they say B'nenu zeh, this is our son. And so it seems there that the word zeh is actually kind of intrusive. It doesn't really belong. And it's kind of begging to have us learn something from it. So Shma mina prat l'sumin hudat. So from the fact that we have this word which really doesn't fit, we learn that you have to be able to point at your child and see them in order to bring them as a ben or a mora, so blind people are out. Aval hacha, but here, ilav ba'avur zeh mai lichtov. If it didn't say because of this, what would it say? Like, we need the words because of this. They actually mean because of this. Ela ba'avur matzo maro hudata. They in fact come because there is something that you're supposed to be pointing at. You're supposed to be saying to your child, hey, look at this thing. Do you see this? Because of this, something happened. Right, so the word's not extra, it belongs there. So lefikach anachnu chayvim. Therefore, we are obligated. So this last sentence is sort of put in the mouths of Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef, that they don't actually disagree about any of the big questions with Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. Everybody agrees that matzah is d'Rabbanan. Everybody agrees kol detakun Rabbanan kein deoraita takun, that when the rabbis legislated, they used Torah parameters. Everybody agrees that a ben sora umora cannot be brought by blind parents. What the Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef are disagreeing about is the interpretation of the pasuk about telling your child about the Pesach. And they say, well, actually, the word zeh is an extra here, so I can't learn anything from it because it belongs. Whereas apparently Rav Acha Bar Yaakov felt otherwise. Okay, that is the end. The question of which mitzvot blind people are obligated in, by the way, never really goes away. But the position that we rule like in general is that it doesn't matter, because anything that they're not obligated in from the Torah, they're certainly obligated in from rabbinically. So there might be an issue in terms of they're fulfilling other people's obligations, but there's no question of whether they're supposed to do mitzvot. Except possibly for things that you actually have to look at something in order to do. It is not entirely clear that they could do a mitzvah that would require reading, for example. But maybe. Okay. So that brings us to the end of Magid. The next section in the Gemara is going to be about Hallel, both about Hallel on Pesach and also about Hallel in general. There will be the question of how do you spell the word Hallelujah. They have a space before the Yud Hey at the end. and likewise the other words that end ya, yedidia, merchavia. So we will deal with all of those things and with the text of Hallel in general next week. Do people have questions or comments?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
So, I'm forgetting it already. So Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef, if there's already this understanding that saying the Haggadah, that blind people may not be chayav doraita, but they certainly are the Rabbanan, and the idea of the Rabbanan, and Rabbanan refers to the generation right after the Churban, then why couldn't Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef have known that? And that's why they're saying the Haggadah or saying Magid.
So that's a weakness in the belief that blind people must be included, D'Rabbanan, which is a position taken by the Tosafists, and as far as I know, it's fairly well accepted in Ashkenaz. I'm not 100% sure how well accepted it is in the rest of the Jewish world. But you're right. The fact is, it seems like the Gemara here assumes that it does matter. And the assumptions that people make about these things lead the people to wildly different results. The Tosfot, I think it's a Tosfot in Eruvin, that says, of course, blind people must actually do mitzvot. If they didn't do mitzvot, in what way would they be Jewish? Like,
right?
No way. Like, I just don't. They just like can't conceive of a world in which there are no positive mitzvot for a sentient grown up in the Jewish community. That's not. But that's an assumption. It's not present in the Gemara.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the Gemara does seem to assume that it matters. Now, if I was a Tosafist and I'm reading this, I would say, well, it seems like what matters is whether Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef are performing the mitzvah for other people. And if they're doing it for other people, then they must think they have the same commandment as other people. And if we think that the rabbis legislated using the same parameters, then we must think that they would at least have legislated their obligation would be inferior, so they can't really, we could talk ourselves around in a circle for a little while until we come up with an interpretation, but it would be weak.
Yeah, it just seems like they're going to such an effort to explain something that might not need so much effort. Maybe not. I
think ultimately that what is happening here is that Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef are acting like perfectly ordinary grown-ups. And the Gemara is trying to derive a broad principle that would explain why, in general, they're entitled to do that. And it is failing to do so. And instead ending up with something very particular and specific to Pesach.
Why did it even have to bring it up? And why did we have to even bring up this?
Well, I think the Gemara would like to be able to say that blind people are exactly like everybody else. Like, I think they would very much like to be able to say that, particularly since they have blind people who seem to be living lives as if blind people are just like everybody else. But they're never quite able to get to that statement.
To that bottom line.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. So they bring this statement of Rav Acha Bar Yaakov in order to disprove it, but they never really end up disproving it.
They never really end up explaining the general behavior of Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshet as, oh yes, blind people are just like everybody else. They
Right.
always end up with a particular, well, this case is different because
Right.
explanation.
Right. Which is standard in Gemara. Yeah.
Yes, and it cuts both ways. On the one hand, it means that you don't end up with the removing the distinction between blind people and sighted people. And on the other hand, if you can conceive of the exceptions in one of two ways. Either you can say, well, obviously blind people are, exactly like everybody else, except in the very particular circumstances where you've proved that they're not, which I think is very much where the Gemara wants to go, and certainly it's where some of the commentators want to go. Or you can say blind people are exactly different than everybody else, except in the very specific cases where you can prove otherwise. And I think for the most part, the Gemara is not tending toward the second, but someone could claim that it was and write a commentary. Like I think it's not logically impossible. It's just not what happened in Jewish history.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it would be wrong because there's no reason why people who can't see should be any less an important part of the Jewish community than people who can.
Right. And if
they're not so generous about people who are deaf.
So people who are deaf from birth, yes, that's true. People who become deaf later on and who are able to speak are in fact treated exactly the same as everybody else. And by the time you get to the Middle Ages, you've already got some proto sign language being developed, and people are already becoming uncomfortable with the idea that deaf people, bye Carrie, that deaf people are not fully thinking beings. But without sign language, the truth is that it might be very difficult to tell whether somebody is a thinking being or not if they can't communicate. It might even be that without language in childhood that your brain doesn't fully develop. Like it's a horrible thing to think about, but it's not impossible.
Yeah.
Thank God we're, there are a lot of human problems that we're not anywhere close to fixing, but we are thoroughly capable of having fully communicative deaf people now. And I think halacha is responsive to that. Maybe not as fast as I want it to be, but it is responsive.
Yeah. If you read, or if someone said to you, "B'neinu zeh," in a vacuum, so outside the context of the Haggadah, you wouldn't think at all that it's referring to a blind person just because it says zeh. You would think, I would think it refers to this child as opposed to my other child that I didn't bring with me, because they're supposed to take the child and bring him somewhere.
I guess it does feel redundant. You can't even say it in English, right? You can say this child or you can say our child, but you can't say both. It's not grammatically illegal in Hebrew quite the way it is in English, but it's still weird.
Right, but doesn't it seem, you wouldn't think, okay, so you need to explain the zeh. That's obvious, because they could have just said not even b'neinu hu, they could have said b'neinu.
Yeah.
Who doesn't even sound right.
Yeah, no,
because he's right there. He's right there. So why b'neinu hu, that one, or he? it's Benenu.
I mean, I guess it depends on how you conceive of the conversation. If you're being interviewed, is this your child? Oh, yes, he's my child. Like, it might be that you need a sentence there. I don't know. It might also be that when the Gemara says Benenu hu, it doesn't really mean that it should say who. It just means Benenu and leave it alone.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's not my point is I wouldn't even think if we weren't talking about Summa right now, I wouldn't even think that this is referring to a blind person, a blind parent saying this is my son. I would think of something else.
Yeah.
To explain the redundant ze. Like it's not, it just wouldn't even enter in my mind.
So I think that it's pretty normal for the Midrash to assume that ze means that you're pointing at something. But I could imagine other Midrashim you could have written, like, you can't do it unless the parents both have right hands with which to point. Or you can't do it unless it's daytime so they can see the kid. Or
right.
You can't, like, it's not the only possible exclusion, but it's a plausible one given the way they read the word zeh.
Right, exactly. That's what I was thinking, is that there could be multiple explanations for this, and to pin it on a blind person, like that wasn't, to me, that wasn't even in my list.
Right. Well, and I don't think, it seems to me that it's, I should never say that something doesn't exist, but it would surprise me to come across a rabbinic writing in which the party at the end of days, in which the rabbis are supposed to dance in a circle and point at God and say Ze Eliva Anvehu, which is one of the midrashim on that pasuk. Right. Don't ask me how you point at God even in Olam Haba, but that's not the point.
Right.
It surprised me a great deal to find a midrash that said, but not the blind rabbis. Like, that would be surprising and frankly disturbing.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that it's there in Ben Surah Mora because, as I said, we're trying to be as exclusionary as possible.
Right, that I know. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Anybody else? Okay. I will see you guys all next Monday night then.
Terrific.
Have a good night. Bye.
Thanks so much, Deborah.
Thank you.
Bye.